The story of the Exodus is one of the most dramatic in all of human history. A nation of slaves. 10 catastrophic plagues. A sea that divided, and a people that walked out of the most powerful empire on earth. For centuries, critics have raised the same challenge. If something so extraordinary happened in Egypt, where are the Egyptian records? Pharaohs documented everything. Victories, defeats, harvests, floods, celestial events. The walls of their temples are covered in hieroglyphic records, stretching back thousands of years. So the question is simple and uncomfortable. Why does Egyptian history appear to say nothing about the 10 plagues? For a long time, many believed the answer was equally simple. It never happened. But history has a way of hiding its most important documents in the most unexpected places, and in this case, the answer had been sitting in a museum in Leiden, Netherlands, for nearly 200 years, waiting, unread, misunderstood, until one man decided to look more carefully. To understand why this document matters, we need to understand what ancient Egypt actually was. Most people imagine the pyramids, the mythology, but Egypt was something else entirely. It was the most sophisticated administrative empire of the ancient world. Egyptian scribes documented everything with obsessive precision. Tax, records, grain harvests, military campaigns, astronomical observations, the height of the Nile flood, the number of workers on a construction site, the price of bread in a specific market on a specific day. Nothing happened in Egypt without being recorded, and this documentation culture created something extraordinary. A papyrus trail stretching back over 3,000 years. Many of these documents survived. Not all, but enough. They survive because Egypt's dry desert climate is one of the best preservation environments on Earth. Papyrus that would rot in weeks in a humid climate can survive for millennia, buried in Egyptian sand. This means that when archaeologists and historians dig through Egyptian records, they are not reading summaries written centuries later. They are reading the original documents, the actual administrative records of the actual empire. Primary sources, direct testimony. The voice of ancient Egypt speaking without intermediary. And that is exactly what makes the Ipuwer papyrus so significant, because it is one of those primary sources, an original Egyptian document, written by an Egyptian scribe, describing events that no Egyptian would have any reason to fabricate, and what it describes is deeply familiar. The document is known today as the Ipuwer papyrus, named after the Egyptian scribe who appears to have written it. Its formal designation is Leiden Papyrus 344. It has been housed in the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, Netherlands, since 1828, when it was purchased from an antiquities dealer in Egypt. For decades after its acquisition, it sat largely on. The museum had thousands of Egyptian artifacts. This particular papyrus seemed, on the surface, like one of many administrative or literary texts. Then, in 1909, a British Egyptologist named Alan Gardner produced the first serious scholarly translation of the text, and what he found stopped him completely. The papyrus describes a period of catastrophic collapse in Egypt, not military defeat, not famine in the ordinary sense. Something far more systematic, far more total. The text describes a series of disasters striking Egypt in sequence. The river turning to blood, widespread death of livestock, darkness covering the land, fire falling from the sky, the collapse of social order, the death of children. Gardner read this and immediately recognized the pattern, not because he was a religious man looking for confirmation, but because he was a scholar trained to recognize historical parallel, and the parallel was impossible to ignore. Let me be specific about what the Ipuwer papyrus actually contained, because the details matter. The text describes a Nile in these terms: the river is blood. That is how the scribe characterizes it, not metaphorically, as a statement of observed catastrophic reality. It describes widespread death of animals across the land, a plague moving through livestock that the Egyptians could not explain or stop. It describes darkness, a darkness that came over Egypt and was not the ordinary darkness of night, a darkness that was total and terrifying. It describes fire. The text says something like fire ran along the ground, combined with hail, an atmospheric event so violent and strange that the Egyptian scribe had no existing vocabulary to fully describe it. It describes the death of children across she paid simultaneously, in a way that broke the social order and caused the Egyptians to weep publicly and openly. And critically, it describes the departure of a large group of people from Egypt. The text says that those who had been servants are now leaving, that gold and precious objects are going with them, that the order of Egyptian society has been inverted. Now compare that list to the 10 plagues of Exodus: water turning to blood, death of livestock, hail and fire, death of the firstborn, and the departure of the Israelites, carrying gold and valuables given to them by the Egyptians. The correspondence is not approximate. It is specific. This is not two stories that happen to share a few similar elements. This is the same series of events described by two completely independent sources from two completely different perspectives. One source is Hebrew, written from the perspective of the people leaving. The other source is Egyptian, written from the perspective of the empire falling apart. Here is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Alan Gardner published his translation in 1909. The parallels were immediately visible to anyone who read both texts. And yet, for decades, the academic establishment largely dismissed the connection. Several reasons were offered. First, scholars argued about the dating. The Ipuwer papyrus is a copy. The papyrus itself dates to around 1250 BC. But most Egyptologists believe it is a copy of an older text, possibly from 1800 BC. The dating debate became a way to avoid engaging with the content. Second, some argued the text was literary rather than historical, that it was a traditional Egyptian lament genre, not a record of real events. But here is the problem with that argument. The Ipuwer papyrus contains specific administrative details that are inconsistent with pure literary invention. Specific references to grain shortages in particular regions. Specific references to the collapse of particular government functions. The kind of precise bureaucratic detail that scribes included when recording real events, not when composing literary lament. Third, and most honestly, there was a resistance in the academic community to anything that appeared to validate biblical narratives. Archaeology and Egyptology in the 20th century were deeply invested in the idea that the Exodus was a myth. Engaging seriously with the Ipuwer papyrus threatened that consensus. And so, the document sat, studied, translated, and largely set aside, until a new generation of researchers began to ask different questions. In recent decades, something has shifted in the academic conversation around the Exodus, not among religious scholars trying to prove the Bible, among archaeologists and Egyptologists who follow the evidence wherever it leads. The Apure papyrus was not the only piece of evidence that began to accumulate. The Tempest Stele, discovered at Karnak, describes a catastrophic storm event during the reign of Pharaoh M. Researchers from the University of Chicago published a study suggesting this event may correspond to the eruption of the Thera volcano, which some researchers connect to the plague narratives. The Tel El-Borg excavations in the Sinai Peninsula have uncovered evidence of a significant population movement through the region during the relevant historical period, and DNA analysis of ancient Egyptian and Semitic populations has begun to reveal evidence of population mixing and movement that the written record alone could not confirm. None of these discoveries proves the Exodus happened exactly as the book of Exodus describes it, but they do something equally important. They establish that the ancient world of the Exodus narrative was real, that the historical conditions described were possible, that movements of populations of that scale happened, that catastrophic environmental event struck Egypt during the relevant period. The absence of evidence is becoming, slowly and reluctantly, evidence of presence. We have now seen this pattern 3 times. We saw Chinese imperial astronomers recording an unexplained solar event during the exact period of the crucifixion, written by people who had never heard of Jesus, recorded because the event was real enough to frighten an emperor. We saw a Vatican document describing the crucifixion from the perspective of the Roman governor who ordered it, a pagan administrator admitting doubt in an official government report. And now we see an Egyptian scribe describing a series of catastrophic events that correspond with extraordinary specificity to the 10 plagues of Exodus, written from the perspective of the civilization that the Bible says was devastated. In each case, the writer had no reason to validate biblical narratives. In each case, they were simply recording what they observed. In each case, what they observed was strange enough, significant enough, and disturbing enough that they felt compelled to write it down. 3 civilizations. 3 completely independent sources. 3 records that point toward the same conclusion, that the events described in the Bible were real enough to leave a mark on the historical record of the ancient world. Not a mark made by believers. A mark made by witnesses who didn't understand what they were witnessing. The Apure papyrus has been in Leiden for nearly 200 years. It is not hidden. It is not suppressed. It sits in a museum, available to any scholar who wants to study it. And yet most people have never heard of it. Not because it was buried, but because it was ignored. Because sometimes the most powerful way to suppress a document is not to destroy it. It is simply to look away. History is full of documents like this, evidence that sits in plain sight, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The Apure papyrus is asking a question that has not yet been fully answered. If an Egyptian scribe, writing from inside the collapsing empire, described the same events that the book of Exodus describes, what does that mean for how we understand ancient history? What does it mean for how we understand the Bible? And what other documents are sitting right now in museums and archives around the world, waiting for someone to finally read them carefully? Write your answer in the comments. Every perspective matters here, believer or skeptic. If this kind of historical investigation moves you, the next video goes even further, because there is a stone inscription found in Israel in 1993 that contains the first non-biblical reference to the house of David, and the archaeologist who found it was told by colleagues that it couldn't possibly be real. That story is coming next. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And share this video with someone who thinks they already know the full story of ancient history. Non eo fas tu.